What actually happened inside medieval castles? After everyone fell asleep, the guard at the eastern tower heard it first, a sound so faint that most men would have missed it entirely, but he had learned to listen for the things that did not belong. It was past midnight, and the castle had settled into that particular silence that comes when even the dogs have stopped their restless pacing. He shifted his weight, felt the cold of the stones seep through his boots, and wondered if he should wake the captain. But then the sound came again, and this time he recognised it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the walls. The castle was never truly empty, even in the deepest hours. There were always people moving through its corridors, though few ever spoke of what they did or why they were awake when others slept. The guard knew this because he had spent 7 years walking these walls, and in that time he had learned that a castle at night was a different place, entirely. It had its own rules, its own rhythms, and if you paid attention you could read them like a shepherd reads the sky before rain. Below him, in the great hall, the fire had been banked for the night. The servants had covered the embers with ash, a careful process that would keep a bed of heat alive until morning. The hall itself stretched long and empty, the tables pushed against the walls, the floor swept clean of bones and bread and all the debris of the evening meal. In the corner near the hearth, a dog slept curled tight, its breath making small clouds in the cold air. The tapestries hung heavy on the walls, their colours muted in the darkness, showing scenes of hunts and battles that no one looked at anymore. In the kitchen, which occupied the entire ground floor of the western tower, a woman named Marjorie sat on a stool near the bread oven. She was not supposed to be there. Her work ended at sunset, and she had a pallet in the servants' quarters where she should have been sleeping. But she came here most nights, when the others were snoring and the kitchen was hers alone. The oven held warmth long after the baking was done, and she liked to sit close to it, her hands wrapped around a cup of small beer, and think about nothing in particular. Sometimes she dozed, sometimes she simply sat. Tonight she was mending a tear in her sleeve, her needle moving slowly in the dim light of a single tallow candle. She heard the footsteps too, though from where she sat they sounded different, lighter, coming down the spiral stairs that connected the kitchen to the private chambers above. She did not look up. She knew who it was, the lady's maid, Catherine, who often came down to fetch wine or bread or sometimes just to walk because she could not sleep. Catherine appeared in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face pale and tired. She nodded at Marjorie but did not speak. She crossed to the pantry, found what she was looking for and left the way she had come. The whole exchange took less than a minute, and when she was gone, the kitchen settled back into its silence. This was how the nights went. Small movements, brief encounters, people crossing paths without explanation, each absorbed in their own private reasons for being awake. The castle at night was a place of permission, where the strict order of the day loosened just enough to let people breathe. No one asked questions, no one expected answers. You saw what you saw and then you forgot it. In the chapel, which stood separate from the main keep, a monk knelt before the altar. He had been there since Compline, the final prayers of the day, and he would remain until matins, the first prayers of the morning. This was his duty, to hold vigil through the night, to keep the space holy and watched. His knees ached. The stone floor was unforgiving, and though he had folded his cloak beneath him, it did little to soften the pressure. He did not mind. Pain was part of the work, a reminder that the body was a temporary vessel, that comfort was not the point. He prayed, but not continuously. Sometimes he simply knelt and let his mind empty, and in those moments he felt closest to something he could not name. The chapel was cold, colder than any other part of the castle, because it had no hearth, no brazier, nothing to warm the air. The monk's breath came out in white puffs, and his fingers were stiff when he tried to turn the pages of his prayer book. He kept a small candle burning on the altar, but its light barely reached the walls. The rest of the chapel was darkness, and he had learned not to look into that darkness too long. Not because he feared it, but because the mind could play tricks when you stared into nothing for hours. He had seen shapes that were not there, heard whispers that were only the wind. He knew better now. He kept his eyes on the flame. Above the chapel, in the Lord's chamber, a different kind of wakefulness held sway. The Lord himself was asleep, his snores audible even through the heavy curtains that surrounded his bed. But his wife lay awake. staring at the ceiling beams, counting the knots in the wood because she had already counted them 1,000 times, and it gave her something to do. She could not remember the last time she had slept through a full night. There was always something. A sound, a thought, a tightness in her chest that would not ease. She had stopped trying to fight it. Now she simply waited for morning, her hands folded on her stomach, her mind drifting through the events of the day and the day before and all the days that blurred together into a single long stretch of duty and repetition. She thought about her daughter, who was 12 and growing too fast. Soon there would be talk of marriage, of alliances, of the girl leaving to live in another castle far away. The thought made her tired. Everything made her tired. She heard a sound from somewhere below, a faint scraping, and wondered if it was the dog or one of the servants or something else entirely. She did not get up to check. Whatever it was not her concern. The castle had people whose job it was to notice such things. She closed her eyes and tried to will herself towards sleep, knowing it would not come. In the stables, a boy named Piers sat in the straw beside a horse that had gone lame. The horse was valuable, brought from Flanders at great expense, and the Lord had made it clear that if the animal did not recover, someone would pay for it. Piers did not think the horse would recover. His foreleg was swollen, hot to the touch, and it flinched when he tried to examine it. But he stayed anyway, because leaving felt wrong. He had brought a blanket and a wineskin filled with water, and he sat with his back against the wooden partition, listening to the horse breathe. The other horses were quiet, some sleeping standing up, others lying down in their stalls. The air smelled of hay and manure and the particular warmth that animals give off in enclosed spaces. Piers was 15, old enough to know his place, but young enough to still hope for something different. He had been working in the stables since he was 8, and he knew horses better than he knew people. He liked their simplicity. You fed them, you groomed them, you kept them healthy, and they did what you asked. There was no ambiguity. People were harder. They said one thing and meant another. They smiled when they were angry. They lied. Horses did not lie. This horse was in pain, and it showed that pain plainly, without pretense. Piers respected that. He reached out and touched the animal's neck, felt the muscles twitch under his hand, and murmured something low and soft that had no real words. Outside, the guard on the eastern tower had moved to the southern wall. He walked slowly, his spear resting on his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the castle. There was nothing to see. The land stretched away in, formless black, the trees invisible, the road invisible, everything swallowed by night. He knew the landscape by daylight. He could picture it now if he tried. The fields, the forest, the river that ran silver in the sun. But at night it was abstract, a space that existed only in his memory. He heard an owl call, a long wavering note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then silence again. He thought about his wife, who lived in the village 2 miles away. He saw her once a week, on his day of rest, and the visits were brief and awkward. They had been married for 3 years and had no children. People had started to talk. He did not know what to do about it. She seemed content enough, or at least she did not complain, but there was a distance between them that he could not cross. He had tried, in the beginning, to speak to her about his work, about the things he saw and thought, but she had no interest. She nodded and smiled and changed the subject, and eventually he stopped trying. Now when he visited, they sat together in near silence, and he felt like a stranger in his own home. The night deepened. In the great hall, the dog woke and stretched and padded over to the door, where it sniffed at the gap beneath, and then returned to its corner. In the kitchen, Marjorie finished her mending and set it aside, then closed her eyes and let herself drift into a light doze, her head tipped back against the wall. In the chapel, the monk rose stiffly to his feet and walked a slow circle around the altar, trying to bring feeling back into his legs. In the Lord's chamber, the lady finally slept, her breathing evening out, her face smoothing into something like peace. In the stables, Piers pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and settled in for the long hours until dawn. The castle breathed around them. Its stones expanded and contracted with the changing temperature. Its timbers creaked. Its shadows shifted as the moon moved across the sky. It was a living thing in its way, built by hands long dead, inhabited by people who would themselves be gone in a few decades, and yet it endured. It had stood for over 200 years, and it would stand for 200 more, long after everyone now within its walls had been forgotten. There were rats in the walls. You could hear them sometimes, skittering through the spaces between the stones, their claws clicking on wood and plaster. The servants set traps, but the rats were too clever. They avoided the obvious dangers, found their way into the stores, gnawed through sacks of grain and left their droppings everywhere. It was a constant battle, and one the servants knew they would never win. The rats had been here first, or at least it seemed that way. They moved through the castle with an ease that humans never achieved, as if they understood its geography better, as if they had mapped every crack and crevice and knew which routes were safe. In the cellars, where the wine and ale were, kept, a man named Thomas worked by the light of a small lantern. He was the cellarer, responsible for the castle's drink, and he had come down to check on a cask that had been giving him trouble. It was leaking just slightly, a thin trickle that pooled on the floor and attracted flies. He had packed the seam with wax 2 days ago, but the leak had returned. Now he knelt beside it, scraping away the old wax, trying to see if the wood itself had split. The cellar was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of fermentation. The walls glistened with moisture, and in some places green mould grew in thick patches. Thomas did not like being down here alone. It was too quiet, too cut off from the rest of the castle. He could not hear anything from above, and if something happened, if the door closed and the latch fell, he would be trapped until someone thought to look for him. It had happened once, years ago, to another cellarer. The man had been down here for 2 days before they found him, half mad with thirst and fear. Thomas kept the door propped open now with a wooden wedge, and he worked quickly, his movements efficient. He did not let himself think about the darkness beyond the reach of his lantern, about the corners where the light did not go. He finished with the cask, tested the seal with his fingers, and stood. His knees cracked. He was getting old, though he did not like to admit it. 53 years, and he felt every one of them in his bones. He picked up the lantern and made his way back toward the stairs, moving carefully because the floor was uneven and slick with spilled beer. As he climbed, the air grew warmer, and he felt the tension in his shoulders ease. When he emerged into the corridor that led to the kitchen, he paused and listened. He could hear someone moving around in there, the soft clink of pottery, the scrape of a stool. He considered going in, perhaps sharing a cup with whoever it was, but decided against it. He was tired. He wanted his bed. The servants' quarters were in the attic of the main keep, a long low-ceilinged room with straw pallets laid out in rows. There were no partitions, no privacy. Men and women slept side by side, separated only by an informal understanding of who belonged where. It was warmer up here than anywhere else in the castle, because heat rose and collected under the roof. In summer it was unbearable, but in winter it was the best place to be. Most of the servants were asleep, their breathing creating a soft collective rhythm. A few snored. One woman coughed, a wet hacking sound that went on for a long time before subsiding. Thomas found his pallet and lay down without undressing. He pulled a blanket over himself and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, as it always did when he was tired enough. He dreamed, though he would not remember it in the morning. Something about a river, and a boat that would not stay upright, and a sense of needing to reach the other side before the sun went down. It made no sense, but dreams rarely did. In the Lord's chamber, the Lord himself woke suddenly disoriented. He had been dreaming too, something about a hunt, a stag that turned and charged at him, its antlers aimed at his chest. He sat up, his heart pounding, and pushed the bed curtains aside. The room was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. His wife slept beside him, undisturbed. He listened. The castle was silent. He did not know what had woken him, whether it was the dream or some sound he had heard without fully registering. He lay back down and stared at the canopy above his head, waiting for his heartbeat to slow. He thought about the taxes he needed to collect, the repairs that needed to be made to the outer wall, the letter he had received from the bishop requesting a donation for the cathedral. Money. It always came back to money. The estate produced enough to sustain itself, but there was never surplus. Every coin was spoken for before it was even collected. He resented it, though he knew better than to complain. He was lucky to have what he had. There were lords who had lost everything, who had borrowed too much and been unable to pay, who had seen their lands seized and their families disgraced. He would not let that happen. He would manage. He always managed. His wife stirred beside him, murmured something in her sleep and rolled over. He looked at her, at the shape of her under the blankets, and felt a tenderness that surprised him. They had been married for 18 years. It had been arranged, as all such marriages were, but they had grown accustomed to each other. There was no passion, but there was something else. Companionship, perhaps. A shared understanding of the burdens they carried. He reached out and touched her shoulder, very lightly, and then withdrew his hand. She did not wake. Down in the courtyard, a cat stalked a mouse. The mouse was foraging near the base of the well, picking through the scraps that the servants had thrown there earlier. It did not see the cat until it was too late. The cat pounced, quick and silent, and there was a brief high-pitched squeak, and then nothing. The cat carried its prize to a corner and settled down to eat, crunching through bones and fur with methodical precision. When it was done, it licked its paws and whiskers clean, then stretched and disappeared into the shadows. The guard on the wall had returned to the eastern tower. He leaned against the parapet and let his eyes close for just a moment. He was not supposed to sleep on duty, but he was so tired, and the night was so long, and nothing ever happened. He would rest for just a moment, just long enough to gather himself. His head drooped, his breathing slowed, and then he jerked awake, startled by a sound that turned out to be nothing. A shutter banging in the wind. He cursed under his breath and straightened up, shaking his head to clear it. He could not afford to be caught sleeping. The penalty was severe. He had seen a man whipped for it once, tied to a post in the courtyard and struck 20 times across the back. The man had screamed. The guard did not want to scream. He walked to the other side of the tower and looked down into the courtyard. He could see the cat, just barely, a darker shape against the dark ground. He watched it slink along the wall and vanish into a doorway. He envied the cat. It had no responsibilities. It did what it wanted, when it wanted, and no one punished it for sleeping when it should have been awake. He sighed and resumed his patrol, forcing his legs to move, forcing his eyes to stay open. In the chapel, the monk had begun to pray again. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, the Latin words flowing in a steady stream. He did not think about what he was saying. The prayers were automatic, learned long ago and repeated so often that they required no conscious effort. His mind was elsewhere, drifting through memories. He thought about his childhood, about the village where he'd grown up, about the brother he had not seen in 15 years. He wondered if his brother was still alive, if he had married, if he had children. The monk had chosen a different path, had given up the possibility of family, and most days he did not regret it. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, he felt the weight of that choice. The candle on the altar guttered and nearly went out. He reached for the spare candles he kept beside him and lit a new one from the dying flame, then set it in place. The light steadied. He returned to his prayers, his hands clasped, his head bowed. Outside, the wind picked up, and he heard it moaning around the corners of the chapel, a low mournful sound that seemed almost alive. He ignored it. He had heard it before. It meant nothing. In the kitchen, Marjorie woke with a start. She had been dreaming about bread, about kneading dough that would not hold together, that kept crumbling in her hands, no matter how much water she added. She blinked and looked around, disoriented. The candle had burned down to almost nothing, a stub of wax with a tiny flame that gave off more smoke than light. She stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness in her back and shoulders. She needed to return to the servants' quarters before someone noticed she was gone. She extinguished the candle and made her way through the dark kitchen, her hands outstretched, touching the familiar shapes of tables and stools and shelves. She knew this room so well she could navigate it blind. The corridor was darker still, but she did not hesitate. She walked quickly, her feet silent on the stone floor, and climbed the stairs to the attic. The others were still asleep. She found her pallet and lay down, pulling the blanket over herself. She was cold now, colder than she had been in the kitchen, and it took a long time for the warmth to return. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind was too active. She thought about the day ahead, about the bread she would need to bake, about the meals she would need to prepare. There was never enough time. There was always too much to do. She sighed and turned onto her side, curling into a ball, and eventually finally sleep found her. In the stables, Piers had fallen asleep sitting up, his head lolling forward onto his chest. The horse beside him had also dozed off, standing with one hind leg relaxed, its eyes half closed. The stable was warm and dark and filled with the soft sounds of animals at rest. A mouse ran across the floor, paused to sniff at a piece of straw, then continued on its way. In the rafters, a barn owl sat motionless, its eyes fixed on the mouse, but it did not strike. It had already eaten. It was simply watching, because that was what owls did. The night wore on. The moon crossed the sky and began its descent toward the western horizon. The stars turned slowly overhead, constellations shifting position in their eternal dance. The castle remained, solid and unchanging, its walls dark against the darker land. Inside, people slept and woke and slept again, each lost in their own small world of dreams and duties and desires. They did not think about the larger forces at work, about the slow turn of history, about the way everything they knew would one day be gone. They thought about tomorrow, about the next meal, about the next task. That was enough. That was all anyone could manage. In the Lord's Solar, a small private room adjacent to the main chamber, a ledger lay open on a desk. The Lord Steward had been working on it earlier, recording the day's expenses, and he had left it there when he went to bed. The pages were covered with neat columns of numbers, income and expenditure, written in a careful hand. The ink had dried. The quill lay beside the ink pot, its tip stained black. In the morning, the steward would return and continue his work, adding more numbers, calculating more sums, trying to make the accounts balance. It was a task that never ended. There was always more to record, always more to calculate. On the desk beside the ledger was a letter, sealed with red wax. It had arrived that afternoon, carried by a messenger who had ridden for 3 days to deliver it. The Lord had not yet opened it. He knew what it contained. A request for soldiers, for men to be sent to fight in a war that seemed to have no end. He would have to comply. He always complied. But he was tired of losing men, of seeing them ride away and never return, of hearing their families weep when the news came that they were dead. He would open the letter in the morning, when he could no longer avoid it. For now, it sat on the desk, a small rectangle of parchment that held within it the weight of obligation and grief. The castle had seen many such letters. It had stood through wars and plagues and famines, through changes of power and changes of fortune. Its walls had witnessed births and deaths, celebrations, and sorrows. It would witness many more. The people who lived here now would pass through, and others would take their place, and the cycle would continue. The stones would endure. They always did. In the great hall, the fire had gone out completely. The ashes were cold, grey, lifeless. In the morning, a servant would come and rake them out and build a new fire, and the hall would warm again, and life would resume its familiar pattern. But for now, it was cold and empty, a space waiting to be filled. The dog had moved to a different corner seeking warmth, and it lay with its nose tucked under its tail, breathing softly. The tapestries hung motionless on the walls. The tables stood in their places. Everything was still. In the village beyond the castle, people slept in their own small homes, cottages with thatched roofs and walls of wattle and daub. They dreamed their own dreams, worried their own worries. They knew the castle was there, looming over them, a constant presence that shaped their lives in ways they rarely questioned. They paid their rents. They worked the Lord's fields. They attended the chapel on feast days. They did what was expected because that was the way things were. Some resented it. Most accepted it. A few never thought about it at all, too busy with the immediate demands of survival to consider the larger structures that governed their existence. The miller slept in his mill, the rhythmic sound of the water wheel a background hum that he no longer heard. The blacksmith slept in his forge, his hands still smelling of metal and smoke. The priest slept in his small house beside the church, his breviary open on the table beside his bed. They were all part of the same system, interconnected, dependent on each other in ways that were rarely spoken but always understood. The castle needed the village needed the castle. It was a balance, delicate and imperfect, but it held. Back in the castle, in the eastern tower, the guard yawned and rubbed his eyes. The sky had begun to lighten, just barely, a faint grey glow on the horizon that signalled the approach of dawn. He felt a surge of relief. His watch was almost over. Soon he would be relieved, and he could go to the barracks and sleep for a few hours before his duties resumed. He looked out over the land, and now he could see shapes emerging from the darkness. The trees, the fields, the road, the world coming back into focus. In the kitchen, the first servant of the day arrived, a young woman named Alice who was responsible for lighting the fires. She moved quickly, efficiently, gathering kindling and arranging it in the hearth. She struck flint against steel, sending sparks into the tinder, and blew gently until a flame caught. The fire grew, spreading from the kindling to the larger logs, and the kitchen began to warm. Alice stood and stretched, feeling the heat on her face, and then set about preparing for the morning meal. There was porridge to make, bread to warm, ale to pour. The household would wake soon, and they would be hungry. In the chapel, the monk heard the bell for matins, a single clear note that rang out across the castle. He rose from his knees, his joints protesting, and made his way to the sacristy to prepare for the service. His vigil was over. He'd kept watch through the night, and now the day was beginning. He felt tired but also peaceful, the kind of peace that came from fulfilling a duty, from doing what was required without complaint or expectation of reward. He washed his face in a basin of cold water, dried it with a rough towel, and returned to the chapel to wait for the others who would join him in prayer. In the Lord's chamber, the lady woke first. She lay still for a moment, listening to her husband's breathing, then slipped out of bed and crossed to the window. She unlatched the shutters and pushed them open, letting in the cold morning air. The sky was pale, washed with the colours of approaching dawn. She could see the courtyard below, the well, the buildings that surrounded it. A few people were already moving about, starting their work. She watched them for a moment. These people whose names she barely knew, whose lives intersected with hers only in the most superficial ways. She felt a strange sense of disconnection, as if she were watching a scene from a play, something distant and unreal. She turned away from the window and began to dress. Her maid would arrive soon to help her, but she preferred to start on her own, to have a few moments of privacy before the day's demands descended. She pulled on a linen shift, then a woolen gown, lacing it slowly. Her fingers were cold, and the laces were stiff. She heard her husband stir behind her, groaning as he sat up. He did not speak. He never spoke in the mornings until he had been awake for a while. She did not mind, she had nothing to say either. In the stables, Piers woke to find the horse standing over him, its head lowered, its breath warm on his face. He sat up quickly, alarmed, but the horse did not move. It simply stood there, watching him with dark, liquid eyes. He reached out and touched its nose, and the horse nuzzled his hand. The swelling in its leg seemed no worse, and that was something. He stood and examined it more closely, running his fingers gently over the hot skin. The horse flinched but did not pull away. Piers decided he would tell the head groom to send for the farrier, though he doubted there was much the man could do. Sometimes horses healed, sometimes they did not. It was in God's hands, as everything was. He left the stable and walked across the courtyard to the well. He drew a bucket of water and drank deeply, the cold liquid shocking his throat. He splashed water on his face and neck, shook himself like a dog, then headed toward the kitchen. He was hungry. There would be porridge, and maybe bread if he was lucky. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, and the warmth enveloped him. Alice looked up from the hearth and nodded. She ladled porridge into a wooden bowl and handed it to him. He took it gratefully and sat on a stool near the fire, eating quickly, barely tasting the food. The castle was waking. Doors opened and closed, voices called out, footsteps echoed in the corridors. The night was over, and the day had begun. But the memory of the night lingered, the quiet hours when the castle had belonged to a few wakeful souls, when its true nature had been visible. That was gone now, hidden again beneath the activity and noise of daily life. But it would return. It always did. When the sun set and the darkness came, the castle would transform once more, and the night people would emerge to inhabit its secret spaces. The guard on the eastern tower was relieved by another man, who arrived yawning and rubbing sleep from his eyes. They exchanged a few words, a brief report that nothing had happened, and then the first guard descended the stairs and made his way to the barracks. He removed his boots and lay down on his cot without bothering to undress. Sleep came instantly, a deep, dreamless sleep that would last until midday. In the great hall, servants were setting up the tables for the morning meal. They worked in silence, their movements practised and efficient. They laid out bread and cheese and cold meat, pitchers of ale and cups. The lord and his family would eat in the solar, but the rest of the household would gather here. It was one of the rituals that structured the day, a moment when everyone came together, however briefly, before dispersing to their various tasks. The monk finished his prayers and left the chapel. He walked slowly back to the small house he shared with 2 other monks, his steps heavy with exhaustion. Inside he found bread and ale waiting for him, left by one of his brothers. He ate without enthusiasm, his mind already turning toward the work that awaited him. He was responsible for the castle's small library, a collection of books and manuscripts that he tended with great care. He would spend the morning there, copying a text, checking for damage, ensuring that nothing was lost. It was quiet work, solitary, and he was grateful for it. The lady's maid, Catherine, knocked softly on the chamber door and entered when she heard the lady's voice. She carried a basin of warm water and fresh linen, and she set about helping the lady finish dressing. They did not speak. There was no need. They had performed this ritual countless times, and it required no words. Catherine braided the lady's hair, coiling it at the nape of her neck and pinning it in place. She fastened a veil over it, adjusting it so it fell correctly. The lady examined herself in a small polished mirror, then nodded. Catherine stepped back and gathered up the discarded nightclothes, preparing to take them to be washed. In the courtyard, the day had fully arrived. The sun was above the horizon now, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. People moved with purpose, carrying baskets and tools, leading horses, calling to each other. The castle had shed its nighttime stillness and become a place of work and noise and life. But beneath it all, the stones remembered. They held the memory of every night that had passed, every person who had walked their corridors in darkness, every secret moment of silence and solitude. They would hold those memories forever, long after everyone now living had turned to dust. The lord emerged from his chamber and made his way to the solar, where his breakfast was waiting. He sat at the table and ate mechanically, his mind already engaged with the tasks of the day. He would meet with his steward to discuss the accounts. He would inspect the repairs being made to the outer wall. He would open the letter that sat on his desk and compose a reply. He would do what was required of him, as he always did, because that was his role. He was the lord, the castle was his responsibility. He could not afford to fail. His wife joined him, sitting across the table. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. There was no tension between them, but no warmth either. They were partners in a shared enterprise, nothing more. When the meal was finished, they rose and went their separate ways, the lady to her solar, where she would spend the morning with her embroidery, the lord to his study, where duty awaited. In the kitchen, Marjorie had arrived and taken over from Alice. She moved through her work with practised ease, her hands never still. There were pies to make, vegetables to chop, meat to prepare. The kitchen was the heart of the castle, the place where raw ingredients were transformed into meals, where the alchemy of cooking took place. Marjorie understood this. She took pride in her work, even when it exhausted her. She knew that without her, and the others like her, the castle would cease to function. They were the ones who kept everything running, who made it possible for the lord and his family to live their lives of relative comfort. They were invisible most of the time, but they were essential. The day unfolded in its usual pattern. Work was done. Tasks were completed. The sun moved across the sky. People came and went, each playing their part in the great machinery of the household. And as the afternoon wore on, shadows began to lengthen, and everyone knew that night would come again. The cycle would repeat. It always did. The steward entered the lord's study carrying the ledger and a bundle of papers. He was a thin man with sharp features and ink-stained fingers, perpetually worried about something. The lord gestured for him to sit, and they spent the next hour going through the accounts. The steward read aloud from the ledger, listing expenses and income, while the lord listened and occasionally asked a question. The numbers were not good. They never were. There was a shortfall, as there always seemed to be, and the steward suggested raising the rents on the tenants in the village. The lord considered this. He did not like raising rents. It made him unpopular, and unpopularity could lead to trouble. But what choice did he have? He needed the money. They discussed it at length, weighing the risks and benefits, until finally the lord agreed. The rents would be raised, but only slightly. enough to make a difference, but not so much that it would cause rebellion. The steward made a note of it in the ledger and moved on to the next item, the repairs to the outer wall. The masons had sent an estimate and it was higher than expected. The Lord sighed. Everything was always more expensive than expected. He approved the expense anyway, because the wall was necessary. A castle without strong walls was no castle at all. When they were finished, the steward gathered up his papers and left. The Lord sat alone in his study, staring at the letter on his desk. He knew he could not put it off any longer. He broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The message was brief. The king requested 20 men-at-arms to serve in the ongoing campaign against the northern rebels. They were to be ready to march within a fortnight. The Lord read the letter twice, then set it aside and rubbed his face with his hands. 20 men. He could spare them, barely, but it would leave the castle undermanned, and there was no guarantee they would return. Many would not. He thought about the families in the village, the wives and children who would lose their men. He thought about the young boys who would be called up, eager for glory, not understanding what war really meant. He took up a quill and began to write his response. He would comply, of course. There was no question of refusing. But he wrote carefully, choosing his words to convey both loyalty and concern. He explained the situation, the shortfall in his finances, the strain on his household. He asked for leniency, though he knew it would not be granted. When he was finished, he sealed the letter and set it aside for the messenger to collect. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out over his lands. The fields were green, the crops growing well. It would be a good harvest if the weather held. That was something, at least. In the lady's solar, the lady sat with her embroidery frame, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with mechanical precision. She was working on a tapestry, a scene of a garden with flowers and birds. It was slow work, requiring patience and attention to detail, and she had been at it for months. She did not particularly enjoy it, but it gave her something to do, a way to fill the empty hours. Her daughter sat beside her, reading from a book of prayers. The girl's lips moved silently as she read, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was a serious child, more interested in books than in dolls, and the lady did not know what to make of her. She had hoped for a daughter who would be more like other girls, more interested in clothes and music and courtship. But this child was different, and the lady had learned to accept it. They sat together in companionable silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of pages. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky. The day was warm, unseasonably so, and the lady had opened the window to let in fresh air. She could hear the sounds of the courtyard below, the voices of the servants, the clatter of tools. It was a soothing background noise, a reminder that life went on, that the world kept turning. She thought about the conversation she had overheard the night before, between her husband and his steward. She had not meant to eavesdrop, but their voices had carried through the thin walls. She knew about the letter, about the king's demand for men. She knew her husband was worried, though he tried to hide it. She wished she could help, but there was nothing she could do. Her role was to manage the household, to oversee the servants, to raise her daughter. Beyond that, she had no power. The decisions were made by men, and she could only watch and wait. Her daughter looked up from her book and asked a question about a word she did not understand. The lady explained it patiently, then returned to her embroidery. The afternoon wore on. The light shifted, growing softer, more golden. The shadows in the room lengthened. The lady's needle continued its steady rhythm, in and out, building the image one stitch at a time. In the kitchen, Marjorie was preparing the evening meal. It was a complicated affair involving multiple dishes, and she worked with intense concentration. She had 3 assistants helping her, young girls who were still learning, and she directed them with a mixture of patience and firmness. One girl was chopping vegetables, another was turning meat on a spit over the fire, and the third was preparing a sauce. Marjorie moved between them, checking their work, offering advice, correcting mistakes. She had been doing this for 20 years, and she knew every aspect of the process by heart. The kitchen was hot, the air thick with steam and smoke. Marjorie's face was flushed, her hair damp with sweat. She paused to wipe her forehead with the back of her hand, then returned to her work. There was no time to rest. The meal had to be ready at the appointed hour, and there was still much to do. She tasted the sauce, decided it needed more salt, and added a pinch. She checked the meat, turning it to ensure it cooked evenly. She inspected the vegetables, nodding with satisfaction. Everything was proceeding as it should. She thought about the night ahead, about the quiet hours when she would sit alone by the oven. She looked forward to those moments, to the peace they brought. During the day, she was constantly surrounded by people, constantly working, constantly needed. But at night, she was free. She could think her own thoughts, be her own person. It was a small freedom, but it was hers, and she treasured it. In the stables, Piers was grooming one of the horses, brushing its coat until it shone. The lame horse stood in its stall, still favouring its injured leg. Piers had spoken to the head groom, who had promised to send for the farrier, but the man had not yet arrived. Piers checked the horse's leg again, running his hands gently over the swelling. It was slightly less hot than before, which he took as a good sign. Maybe the horse would recover after all. He hoped so. He hated to see animals suffer. The other stable boys were working nearby, mucking out stalls and refilling water troughs. They worked in silence, each absorbed in their own tasks. It was hard work, physical and repetitive, but Piers did not mind. He liked being around horses. They were honest creatures, straightforward in their needs and desires. You always knew where you stood with a horse. They did not play games or tell lies. They simply were. One of the other boys called out to him, asking if he wanted to go into the village after their work was done. Piers considered it. He rarely went into the village. He had no family there, no friends. But sometimes it was nice to get away from the castle, to see different faces, to walk different streets. He nodded. Yes, he would go. The other boy grinned and returned to his work. Piers finished grooming the horse, gave it a pat on the neck and moved on to the next stall. The afternoon faded into evening. The sun sank lower in the sky, its light turning the stones of the castle warm and golden. In the great hall, servants were setting up for the evening meal. Long tables were arranged, benches pulled out, platters and cups set in place. The fire had been rebuilt, and it crackled cheerfully, sending sparks up the chimney. The hall was transforming from an empty space into a place of gathering, of community. The household began to assemble. The lord and his family entered first, taking their places at the high table. Then came the knights and men-at-arms, followed by the servants. Everyone had their assigned place, and they took it without needing to be told. It was a ritual, performed every evening, and it provided a sense of order and structure. The meal was served, and people ate and talked, their voices rising to fill the hall. It was a brief moment of warmth and connection, before everyone dispersed again to their separate tasks and concerns. The food was simple but plentiful. There was roasted meat, bread, vegetables, cheese. Ale flowed freely, and people drank with appreciation. Marjorie and her assistants moved between the tables, ensuring that everyone had enough, that no cup went empty. They worked with quiet efficiency, their presence barely noticed. When the meal was finished, the tables were cleared and people began to leave. Some returned to their duties, others went to their beds. The hall emptied slowly, until only a few remained, lingering by the fire. The lord retired to his chamber with his wife. They undressed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The day had been long, and they were both tired. The lord climbed into bed and pulled the curtains closed. His wife joined him, lying on her side, her back to him. They did not speak. Within minutes the lord was asleep, his breathing deep and regular. The lady lay awake as she always did, staring into the darkness, waiting for sleep that would not come. In the chapel, the monk prepared for his vigil. He lit the candles on the altar, arranged his prayer book, and knelt on the cold stone floor. Another night of watching, of prayer, of solitude. He did not mind. This was his calling, his purpose. He had given his life to God, and God had given him this duty. He would fulfill it faithfully, as he had every night for the past 10 years. He began to pray, his voice low and steady, the Latin words flowing like water. In the kitchen, Marjorie finished cleaning up from the evening meal. Her assistants had gone to bed, and she was alone. She banked the fire in the hearth, covered the embers with ash, and sat down on her stool by the oven. She had brought her cup of small beer, and she sipped it slowly, savouring the taste. The kitchen was warm and quiet, and she felt the tension of the day begin to drain away. She closed her eyes and let herself relax, let her mind drift. She thought about her life, about the choices she had made. She had never married. There had been opportunities when she was younger, but she had turned them down. She had not wanted to be tied to a husband, to be subject to his will. She had wanted her own life, her own space. Working in the castle kitchen had given her that. She was paid a small wage, enough to sustain herself, and she had a degree of independence that few women enjoyed. It was not perfect, but it was hers. In the stables, Piers and the other stable boy left for the village. They walked along the road in the gathering darkness, their footsteps loud on the packed earth. The village was not far, perhaps 20 minutes on foot. They talked as they walked, about horses and work and other inconsequential things. When they reached the village, they went to the tavern, a small building with a low ceiling and a dirt floor. It was crowded and noisy, full of men drinking and talking. Piers and his companion found a corner and ordered ale. They sat and drank, watching the other patrons, listening to the conversations around them. One man was complaining about the Lord, about the rents being raised. Others joined in, voicing their own grievances. Piers listened but said nothing. He worked for the Lord. He did not feel comfortable criticising him, even in the relative safety of the tavern. His companion seemed to feel the same way, because he also remained silent. They finished their ale and left, walking back to the castle in the darkness. The night was cool, and the stars were bright overhead. They walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Back at the castle, the guard on the eastern tower had begun his watch. He walked the familiar circuit, his spear on his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkness. Everything was quiet. The castle was settling into its nighttime rhythm, and he was part of that rhythm. He thought about the conversation he had overheard in the village, about the complaints against the Lord. He understood the frustration. Life was hard for the villagers, and the Lord was an easy target for their anger. But he also knew that the Lord had his own burdens, his own pressures. It was not a simple matter of good and bad. It was complicated, like everything else. He reached the southern wall and paused, looking out over the land. The moon was rising, casting a pale light over the fields and forests. He could see the river in the distance, a silver ribbon winding through the darkness. It was beautiful in its way, this quiet landscape. He felt a moment of peace standing there on the wall, alone with his thoughts. Then he resumed his patrol, his footsteps echoing on the stone. In the Lord's chamber, the Lord lay awake, his mind turning over the events of the day. He thought about the letter he had sent, about the men he would have to send to war. He thought about the rents he had raised, about the families who would struggle to pay them. He thought about the weight of responsibility, about the constant pressure to make decisions that affected so many lives. He wished sometimes that he could step away from it all, that he could be free of the burden. But he knew that was impossible. He had been born into this role, and he would carry it until he died. Beside him, his wife had finally fallen asleep. Her breathing was soft and even. He turned his head to look at her, at the shape of her in the darkness. He felt a tenderness toward her, a gratitude for her presence. She asked for nothing, complained about nothing. She simply endured, as he did. They were partners in this, life, bound together by duty and circumstance. He reached out and touched her hand very gently, and she did not wake. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. In the great hall, the last embers of the fire were dying. The dog lay curled in its corner, dreaming whatever dreams dogs have. The tapestries hung on the walls, their scenes of hunts and battles fading into the shadows. The hall was empty and cold, waiting for morning. In the chapel, the monk continued his prayers. His voice was steady, unwavering, a constant presence in the darkness. He did not think about time, about how many hours remained until dawn. He simply prayed, letting the words carry him through the night. Outside, the wind picked up again, moaning around the corners of the chapel, but he did not hear it. He was lost in his devotions, in the rhythm of prayer. In the kitchen, Marjorie dozed in her chair, her head tipped back against the wall. She dreamed of nothing in particular, just fragments of images and sensations, the warmth of the oven, the smell of bread, the sound of rain on the roof, simple things, comforting things. She stirred occasionally, shifting position, but she did not wake. She would stay there until the early hours of the morning, until the first servants arrived to start the day's work. Then she would slip away, back to her pallet in the attic, and sleep for a few hours before beginning again. The castle breathed around her, around all of them. Its stones held the cold of the night, releasing it slowly as the hours passed. Its timbers creaked and groaned, settling into themselves. Its shadows moved and shifted with the changing angles of the moonlight. It was alive, in its way, a living thing that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. The people who lived within it were temporary, passing through like water through a stream. They would be born, they would live, they would die, and the castle would remain. In the cellars, the wine aged in its casks, the ale fermented slowly. In the storerooms, grain and dried meat and other provisions waited to be used. In the armoury, weapons hung on the walls, swords and spears and shields ready for war. Every part of the castle had its purpose, its function. Everything fit together into a whole, a system that had been refined over generations. It was not perfect, but it worked. It endured. The guard on the wall had completed another circuit. He paused at the western tower and looked up at the sky. The stars were beginning to fade, the first hint of dawn appearing on the horizon. He felt a surge of relief. His watch was nearly over. Soon he would be replaced and he could go to his bed. He resumed his walk, his steps a little lighter now, his mood lifting with the approaching dawn. In the stables, the horses stirred in their sleep. The lame horse stood in its stall, still favouring its injured leg. Piers had returned from the village and checked on it before going to bed. The swelling seemed a little better, and he allowed himself to hope. Maybe the horse would recover. Maybe it would be all right. He lay on his pallet in the stable loft, listening to the sounds of the animals below, and let sleep take him. The night was passing. The castle was moving through its cycle, from darkness toward light, from stillness toward activity. The people within it slept, or woke, or kept watch, each playing their small part in the larger whole. They did not think about the passage of time, about the way one day followed another in an endless succession. They thought about the immediate, the tangible, the next meal, the next task, the next moment. That was all they could manage. That was all anyone could manage. In the Lord's Solar, the ledger still lay open on the desk. The numbers were recorded, the accounts balanced as well as they could be. In the morning, the steward would return and continue his work, adding new entries, making new calculations. The work never ended. There was always more to do. In the Lady's Solar, the embroidery frame stood near the window, the half-finished tapestry still stretched across it. The garden scene was taking shape, the flowers and birds emerging from the fabric. In the morning, the lady would return and add a few more stitches and a few more the day after that. It would take months to finish, maybe years. But she would finish it eventually. She always did. In the chapel, the candle on the altar had burned down again. The monk rose to replace it, moving stiffly, his joints aching. He lit a new candle and set it in place, then returned to his prayers. The darkness was beginning to lift, the first grey light of dawn seeping through the windows. Soon it would be time for matins, and the other monks would join him. But for now he was alone, and he treasured these last quiet moments of the night. The guard on the eastern tower saw the sun break over the horizon, a brilliant point of light that spread quickly across the sky. The Yi world came into focus, the landscape emerging from shadow. He could see the fields, the forest, the river, all painted in the warm colours of dawn. It was beautiful. He stood and watched for a moment, then resumed his patrol. His relief would arrive soon, and his watch would be over. In the kitchen, Alice arrived to start the fires. She found Marjorie asleep by the oven and woke her gently. Marjorie stirred, opened her eyes, and smiled. She stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness in her back. Another night had passed. Another day was beginning. She gathered her things and made her way to the attic, where she would sleep for a few hours before returning to her work. The castle was waking. Doors opened. Voices called out. Footsteps echoed in the corridors. The night was over, and the day had begun. The cycle repeated as it always did, as it always would. The castle endured, and the people within it carried on, doing what needed to be done, living their lives as best they could. The sun rose higher, its light streaming through the windows, warming the cold stones. In the great hall, servants were building a new fire, raking out the ashes from the night before. In the courtyard, people were gathering, preparing for the day's work. The castle was returning to life, shedding its nighttime stillness, becoming once again a place of activity and purpose. But the memory of the night remained. It always did. In the quiet moments, in the pauses between tasks, people would remember. The guard would remember his lonely vigil on the wall. The monk would remember his hours of prayer in the chapel. Marjorie would remember her peaceful solitude by the oven. Piers would remember sitting with the lame horse, hoping it would heal. These were the moments that defined them, that gave meaning to their lives. Not the grand events, the wars and marriages and political manoeuvrings, but the small quiet moments, the times when they were alone with their thoughts, when they could be themselves, without pretense or performance. The castle held these moments, preserved them in its stones. Every person who had ever lived within its walls had left a trace, an echo. The castle remembered them all, though no one living knew their names or their stories. They had been born, they had lived, they had died, and the castle remained. It would always remain, a testament to the continuity of life, to the way one generation followed another in an endless chain. The lord sat at his desk and opened the ledger. The steward had arrived and they were going through the accounts again, checking for errors, making adjustments. It was tedious work, but necessary. The lord forced himself to concentrate, to focus on the numbers. Outside he could hear the sounds of the castle waking up, the voices and footsteps and clattering tools. Life was continuing as it always did. His wife sat in her solar with her embroidery, her needle moving in its steady rhythm. Her daughter was beside her, reading. They worked in silence, each absorbed in their own task. The morning light streamed through the window, warming the room. It was peaceful, this moment, and the lady allowed herself to enjoy it. There would be other moments, less pleasant, but for now she was content. In the kitchen, Marjorie had returned after her brief rest. She was preparing the morning meal, directing her assistants, checking the food. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting and stirring and tasting. She was tired, but she did not let it slow her. There was work to be done, and she would do it. That was her role. That was what she knew. In the stables, Piers was mucking out stalls. The lame horse stood in its stall and he paused to check its leg. The swelling had gone down further. The horse was healing. Piers felt a surge of relief and happiness. He had hoped, and his hope had been rewarded. He gave the horse a pat and continued his work, whistling softly to himself. The day unfolded. Tasks were completed. Meals were prepared and eaten. Conversations were had. Decisions were made. The castle functioned as it always did, a complex system of interconnected parts, each necessary to the whole. And as the sun moved across the sky, as the shadows shifted and changed, everyone knew that night would come again. The cycle would repeat. It always did. The castle had stood for over 200 years. It had seen wars and plagues and famines. It had seen births and deaths, joy and sorrow. It had witnessed the best and worst of humanity, the capacity for kindness and cruelty, for love and hatred. And through it all, it had endured. Its stones were strong, its foundations deep. It would stand for another 200 years, maybe more. Long after everyone now living had been forgotten, the castle would remain, a silent witness to the passage of time. As evening approached, the household began to prepare for the night. Fires were banked, animals were secured, the guard prepared for his watch, the monk prepared for his vigil. Marjorie finished her work and looked forward to her quiet hours by the oven. Everyone had their role, their routine. They knew what was expected, and they fulfilled their duties without complaint. The sun set, and darkness came. The moon rose, casting its pale light over the land. The stars emerged, brilliant points in the black sky. The castle settled into its nighttime stillness, and the night people emerged. The guard walked the walls. The monk knelt in the chapel. Marjorie sat by the oven. Piers sat with the horse, each alone with their thoughts, each finding their own small measure of peace in the quiet hours. The castle breathed. It lived. It endured. And the night went on, as it always had, as it always would. The cycle continued, unchanging and eternal, a rhythm as old as the stones themselves. And within that rhythm, within that endless repetition, people found their moments of meaning, their small islands of connection and purpose. They lived there, lives as best they could, doing what needed to be done, finding joy where they could, enduring hardship when they must. The night deepened. The moon crossed the sky, the stars turned overhead, and in the morning the sun would rise again, and the cycle would begin anew. The castle would wake, the people would resume their work, and life would continue as it always did, one day following another in an endless chain that stretched back into the past and forward into the future, connecting everyone who had ever lived within these walls, everyone who ever would. This was the castle. This was the life it held. Simple, repetitive, often hard, but also filled with small moments of grace and beauty and connection. The guard watching the sunrise, the monk finding peace in prayer, Marjorie sitting by the warmth of the oven, Piers seeing the horse begin to heal. These were the moments that mattered, that gave life its meaning and purpose. Not the grand gestures or dramatic events, but the small, quiet moments, the times when people were most truly themselves. And the castle remembered them all, every person who had ever lived within its walls, every moment of joy and sorrow, every prayer and curse and whispered confidence. The stones held these memories, preserved them against the ravages of time. They would hold them forever, long after the last person had left, long after the castle itself had crumbled into ruin. The memories would remain, echoing through eternity, a testament to the lives that had been lived here, to the people who had loved and worked and hoped and dreamed within these ancient walls. The night wore on, the castle breathed, and in the silent hours before dawn, when the world was at its quietest, when even the night people had grown still, there was a moment of perfect peace, a moment when everything was balanced, when the past and present and future all existed together in harmony. It was brief, this moment, lasting only as long as a single breath, but it was there, and the castle felt it, and in feeling it, the castle knew that all was well, that life would continue, that the cycle would repeat, that the world would endure. And then the moment passed, and the night moved on, and the castle waited for the dawn. The dawn that followed was different from the one before, though to most it would have seemed the same. The sun rose at the same angle, painting the same stones with the same golden light. The servants woke at the same hour, performing the same tasks they had performed yesterday and would perform tomorrow. But for those who paid attention, there were small variations, tiny shifts in the pattern that marked the passage of time. The guard who had completed his night watch on the eastern tower was a different man than the one who had walked those same stones the night before. Not in appearance, but in something deeper. He had been on duty for 6 nights in a row, and the exhaustion was beginning to show. His movements were slower, his reactions dulled by lack of sleep. When he was finally relieved and made his way to the barracks, he collapsed onto his cot fully clothed, and fell into a sleep so deep that his companions could not wake him even when they tried. In the kitchen, Alice was preparing the morning meal with the same efficiency she always showed, but today her mind was elsewhere. Her younger sister was sick, had been sick for 3 days now, and Alice was worried. The girl had a fever that would not break, and their mother had sent word asking Alice to come home if she could be spared. But Alice could not be spared. The kitchen needed her, and there was no one else who could do her work. So she stayed, and she worried, and she tried not to think about what might happen if her sister did not improve. She laid out bread and cheese for the household, poured ale into pitchers, stirred the porridge that bubbled over the fire. Her hands moved automatically, performing tasks she had done so many times she no longer needed to think about them. But her mind was in the village, in the small cottage where her family lived, imagining her sister lying on a pallet, her face flushed with fever, her mother sitting beside her with a damp cloth. Marjorie arrived and saw immediately that something was wrong. She said nothing, but she moved closer to Alice, working beside her in silence. After a few minutes, she asked quietly what was troubling her. Alice told her about her sister, about the fever, about her worry. Marjorie listened, nodding, and when Alice had finished, she said that she would speak to the head cook about giving Alice a few hours to visit her family. It was not much, but it was something. Alice felt tears prick her eyes and had to look away. She mumbled her thanks and returned to her work. In the chapel, the monk who had kept vigil through the night was replaced by another. They exchanged a few words, a brief acknowledgement of duty fulfilled and duty assumed. The first monk made his way back to his quarters, moving slowly, his body stiff from hours of kneeling. He removed his sandals and lay down on his narrow bed, but sleep did not come easily. His mind was too active, Still caught in the rhythm of prayer, he lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the castle waking up around him, before finally drifting off. The second monk settled into his place before the altar and began his prayers. He was younger than the first, perhaps 30 years old, and he approached his duty with a seriousness that bordered on severity. He did not allow his mind to wander. He kept his focus fixed on the words he was saying, on the meaning behind them. He believed deeply in the importance of his role, in the necessity of maintaining constant prayer. Without it, he felt, the world would slip into chaos. So he prayed with intensity, his voice low but firm, and he did not let himself think about anything else. In the stables, Piers arrived early, as he always did. He went immediately to check on the lame horse and found it standing with weight on all four legs. The swelling in its foreleg had gone down considerably, and when he ran his hands over it, the horse did not flinch. Piers felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. The horse was going to be all right. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the animal's neck, feeling the warmth of its body, the steady rhythm of its breathing. Then he set about his other tasks, cleaning stalls, refilling water troughs, checking on the other horses. One of the older stable hands arrived and noticed the improvement in the lame horse. He grunted his approval and said that the farrier would be coming later that day to take a look. Piers nodded. He hoped the farrier would confirm what he already believed, that the horse was healing, that it would be able to work again. He knew the Lord would be pleased. The horse had cost a great deal of money, and its loss would have been a significant blow. As he worked, Piers thought about the previous night, about the trip to the village with the other stable boy. He thought about the conversation he had overheard in the tavern, the complaints about the Lord, the anger in the men's voices. He understood their frustration, but he also understood that life in the castle was not as easy as they imagined. Everyone had their burdens. The Lord worried about money and war, the lady worried about her daughter's future, the servants worried about their families and their health, and whether they would have enough to eat. No one was free from worry. No one was truly safe. The sun climbed higher, and the day's heat began to build. It was going to be another warm day, unseasonably warm for this time of year. The servants moved more slowly, conserving their energy. Water was drawn from the well more frequently, and people paused in shaded areas to catch their breath. The castle's thick walls kept the interior cooler than the outside air, but even so, the heat was oppressive. In the Lord's study, the steward was going through the week's accounts. He had discovered a discrepancy, a missing sum that he could not account for. It was not a large amount, but it troubled him nonetheless. He went through, the ledger line by line, checking each entry, trying to find where the error had occurred. The Lord sat nearby, reading correspondence, only half listening to the steward's muttered calculations. When the steward finally announced that he had found the mistake, a simple error in addition, the Lord nodded absently and returned to his letters. One letter in particular held his attention. It was from a neighbouring lord requesting a meeting to discuss matters of mutual concern. The wording was vague, which made the Lord suspicious. What matters of mutual concern? Were there problems he was not aware of? He made a mental note to discuss it with his advisers later. For now, he set the letter aside and moved on to the next. The morning passed, tasks were completed, meals were prepared and eaten. The castle's daily rhythm continued unbroken. But beneath the surface, small changes were occurring. Alice received permission to visit her sister for 2 hours in the afternoon. The guard who had collapsed in exhaustion woke disoriented and had to be reminded where he was. The lame horse continued to improve, taking tentative steps around its stall. These were small things, barely noticeable in the larger flow of events, but they mattered to the people involved. They were the details that made up a life. In the lady's solar, preparations were being made for an upcoming feast. The lady sat with her steward, discussing menus and seating arrangements. It was to be a celebration of the harvest, a tradition the castle had observed for as long as anyone could remember. The lady took the planning seriously. It was one of her responsibilities, one of the few areas where she had real authority. She wanted everything to be perfect. She reviewed the list of guests, made notes about dietary preferences and potential conflicts between certain families. She discussed the entertainment, music, and perhaps a troupe of players if they could be found. She calculated costs, worrying, as always, about whether they could afford it. Her daughter sat nearby, watching and listening. The girl was learning, preparing for the day when she would have her own household to manage. She asked occasional questions, and her mother answered them patiently. The lady was pleased to see her daughter taking an interest. It suggested a maturity that had been lacking before. Perhaps the girl was finally beginning to understand what would be expected of her. The afternoon heat intensified. Work slowed. People sought shade and rest where they could find it. In the kitchen, Marjorie gave Alice permission to leave, and the young woman hurried out, grateful for the opportunity. She walked quickly down the road toward the village, her mind focused entirely on her sister. She found her family's cottage and went inside, where her mother greeted her with relief. The sister was still feverish, but seemed a little better than she had been. Alice sat beside her, holding her hand, talking to her softly. The girl opened her eyes briefly and smiled before closing them again. Alice stayed for the full 2 hours, then reluctantly returned to the castle. Her worry had eased slightly, but it had not disappeared. In the courtyard, a group of children were playing. They were the offspring of various servants, too young to work but old enough to be unsupervised. They ran and shouted, chasing each other around the well, inventing games that made sense only to them. An older woman sat on a bench nearby, mending clothes, keeping one eye on the children to ensure they did not get into serious trouble. She called out occasionally, warning them to be careful, to stay away from the horses, to stop fighting. The children ignored her for the most part, absorbed in their play. One boy, perhaps 7 years old, had found a stick and was pretending it was a sword. He duelled with imaginary enemies, his movements exaggerated and dramatic. Another child joined him, and they fought a mock battle that ended with both of them collapsing in laughter. The woman on the bench smiled despite herself. Children were resilient. They found joy even in difficult circumstances. It was a gift that adults often lost. The day wore on. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The heat eased slightly, and people resumed their work with renewed energy. In the kitchen, preparations for the evening meal were well underway. Marjorie worked alongside her assistants, checking everything, tasting sauces, adjusting seasonings. She was tired, but she did not show it. She never showed it. That was part of her job, to be steady and reliable no matter what. Alice had returned from the village, and Marjorie could see that the visit had done her good. The young woman seemed calmer, less anxious. Marjorie did not ask for details. She simply welcomed Alice back and set her to work. They fell into their familiar rhythm, working together without needing to speak. It was one of the things Marjorie valued about her job, this sense of companionship, of shared purpose. The kitchen was a community, and she was at its centre. In the great hall, servants were once again setting up for the evening meal. The same tables, the same benches, the same routine. But tonight there was a slight difference. One of the knights who usually ate at the high table was absent, having left that morning on some errand for the lord. His place remained empty, a small break in the pattern. People noticed but said nothing. Absences were common. Men came and went. That was the nature of castle life. The household assembled for the meal. The lord and his family took their places. The knights and men-at-arms followed. Then the servants. Everyone ate and talked, the hall filling with the familiar sounds of communal dining. The food was good, the ale plentiful. People relaxed, enjoying this brief respite from their labours. When the meal ended, they dispersed slowly, reluctant to return to work, but knowing they must. The evening faded into night. The castle began its transformation, becoming once again a place of shadows and silence. The guard on the eastern tower began his watch. The monk in the chapel began his vigil. Marjorie returned to her place by the kitchen oven. Piers checked on the horses one last time before heading to his pallet in the stable loft. The cycle repeated as it always did, as it always would. But tonight, there were visitors. A small group of travellers had arrived just before the gates closed, requesting shelter for the night. The lord had granted it as hospitality demanded. They were merchants, 3 men and 2 women, travelling with a cart full of goods. They had been given space in the great hall near the fire and provided with food and drink. Now they sat talking quietly among themselves, grateful to be inside walls rather than camping on the open road. The guard on the wall watched them from his post. He was curious about who they were, where they had come from, where they were going. But he did not approach them. That was not his role. His role was to watch and wait, to keep the castle safe. The travellers were the Lord's concern, not his. So he turned his attention back to the darkness beyond the walls and continued his patrol. In the chapel, the monk heard the travellers' voices drifting through the night air. He found them distracting, a disruption to the silence he valued. But he did not allow himself to be annoyed. Distractions were a test, an opportunity to strengthen his focus. He redoubled his prayers, speaking the Latin words with renewed intensity, blocking out everything else. One of the travellers, a middle-aged man with greying hair, could not sleep. He rose from his place by the fire and walked to the door of the hall, stepping out into the courtyard. The night air was cool and pleasant after the warmth of the day. He stood for a moment, looking up at the stars, breathing deeply. He had been travelling for weeks, moving from town to town, selling his wares, and he was tired. But there was something peaceful about this place, something that made him feel, just for a moment, that he could rest. He heard footsteps and turned to see the guard approaching. The two men nodded to each other but did not speak. The merchant returned to the hall and the guard resumed his patrol. It was a brief encounter, meaningless in the larger scheme of things, but it was part of the night's tapestry, one thread among many. In the kitchen, Marjorie sat with her cup of small beer, her thoughts wandering. She was thinking about her childhood, about the small farm where she'd grown up. Her parents had been tenants of a different lord, working the land, barely scraping by. She had left when she was 14, seeking something better, and had eventually found her way to this castle. She'd worked here for 26 years now. It was longer than she had lived anywhere else. This was her home, more than the farm had ever been. She thought about the choices she had made, the paths not taken. What would her life have been like if she had stayed on the farm? If she had married one of the village boys who had shown interest in her? Would she have been happier? She did not know. Perhaps happiness was not the point. Perhaps what mattered was simply surviving, making it through each day, finding small moments of peace where you could. That was all anyone could do. The night deepened. The moon rose higher, casting its light through the windows of the castle, creating patterns of silver and shadow. In the Lord's chamber, both the Lord and his wife lay awake, each lost in their own thoughts. They did not speak. They rarely spoke at night. It was as if darkness imposed a silence that neither wanted to break. The Lord was thinking about the meeting his neighbour had requested. He still did not know what it was about, and the uncertainty troubled him. Was there some threat he was not aware of? Some problem that required collective action? Or was it simply a social call? A chance for neighbouring lords to strengthen their ties? He would find out soon enough. The meeting was scheduled for next week. For now, all he could do was wait. His wife was thinking about her daughter, as she so often did. The girl was changing, growing from a child into a young woman. Soon decisions would have to be made about her future. There would be negotiations, contracts, perhaps a journey to meet potential suitors. The lady dreaded it. She did not want her daughter to leave, to go live with strangers in a strange place, but she knew it was inevitable. That was how the world worked. Daughters were valuable commodities, tools for building alliances. Personal feelings did not matter. She turned onto her side, pulling the blankets tighter around herself. She felt cold, though the room was not particularly cold. It was an internal chill, a sense of emptiness that she could not shake. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep remained elusive. In the stables, Piers lay on his pallet, listening to the sounds of the horses below. The lame horse was resting quietly, its breathing steady and calm. Piers felt satisfied, knowing that his care had helped the animal recover. It was a small victory, but it meant something to him. It proved that attention and patience could make a difference, that not everything was beyond his control. He thought about his own future. He was 15, almost 16. In a few years he might be given more responsibility, perhaps even promoted to head groom if he proved himself. Or he might remain where he was, doing the same work year after year until he was too old to continue. He did not know which he preferred. Ambition seemed like a dangerous thing, a path to disappointment. Better perhaps to simply accept what came and make the best of it. The travellers in the great hall had settled down to sleep. They lay wrapped in their cloaks, using their packs as pillows. One of the women was snoring, softly. The fire had died down to embers, and the hall was dark except for the faint glow from the hearth. Outside, the guard continued his patrol, his footsteps a steady rhythm that marked the passage of time. In the cellars, something was moving. Thomas, the cellarer, had heard a noise and come down to investigate. He moved slowly through the darkness, his lantern held high, trying to locate the source of the sound. It turned out to be nothing, just a sack of grain that had fallen over, probably knocked down by rats. He set it upright and checked the surrounding area for signs of damage. The rats had been at it, but not extensively. He made a mental note to set more traps. As he worked, he thought about his life, about the years he had spent in these cellars. It was lonely work, isolating. He rarely saw sunlight, rarely interacted with anyone except when bringing supplies up for meals, but it suited him. He was not a social person. He preferred the company of wine casks and grain, sacks to the company of people. Down here he could work at his own pace, think his own thoughts, be his own person. It was enough. He finished his inspection and made his way back upstairs. The corridor was dark and he moved carefully, his lantern casting strange shadows on the walls. When he reached his pallet in the servants' quarters, he set the lantern down and lay down fully clothed. Sleep came quickly, as it always did after a day of physical labour. The night continued. Hours passed. The moon crossed the sky. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside the castle, people slept or kept watch or sat in solitude. Each was alone with their thoughts, their worries, their hopes. But they were also connected, bound together by their shared existence within these walls. They were part of something larger than themselves, a community that functioned as a whole even when its individual parts seemed isolated and separate. The guard on the wall felt this connection, though he could not have articulated it. As he walked his circuit, he was aware of the people sleeping below him, of the monk praying in the chapel, of the servants dreaming in the attic. He was aware of the castle itself, of its massive presence, its solidity. He was a small part of a larger organism, and that gave him comfort. He was not alone, even when he felt alone. In the chapel, the monk reached a moment of clarity in his prayers. It came suddenly, unexpectedly, a sense of connection to something beyond himself. He had experienced this before, but never quite so intensely. For a brief moment he felt as if he understood everything, as if the purpose and meaning of existence were clear. Then the moment passed, and he was back in the ordinary world, kneeling on cold stone reciting Latin words. But the memory of that clarity remained, and it sustained him through the rest of the night. In the kitchen, Marjorie had dozed off again. Her head was tipped back against the wall, her cup of beer balanced precariously on her lap. She dreamed of warmth and light, of a summer day long ago when she had been young and the world had seemed full of possibility. In the dream, she was walking through a field of wheat, the stalks golden and tall, the sun warm on her face. She felt happy, truly happy, in a way she had not felt in years. Then she woke with a start, and the dream faded. She was back in the kitchen, surrounded by darkness and the smell of baking bread. She sighed and closed her eyes again, trying to recapture the dream, but it was gone. The travellers in the great hall stirred in their sleep. One of them sat up, looked around, then lay back down. The fire had gone out completely now, and the hall was cold. The travellers pulled their cloaks tighter and huddled closer together for warmth. They would be glad when morning came and they could continue their journey. In the Lord's chamber, the Lord had finally fallen asleep, his breathing deep and regular, but his wife remained awake, staring into the darkness, counting the hours until dawn. She had given up trying to sleep. She simply waited, patient and resigned, for the night to end. She thought about nothing in particular, letting her mind drift aimlessly. It was a kind of meditation, a way of passing time without thinking too much. The castle breathed around her, around all of them. Its stones held the cold, releasing it slowly into the air. Its timbers creaked and settled. Its shadows moved with the passage of clouds across the moon. It was alive in its way, a living entity that had existed for centuries and would exist for centuries more. The people within it were temporary, ephemeral, but the castle endured. Dawn approached. The sky began to lighten, the stars fading one by one. The darkness thinned, becoming grey rather than black. The guard on the eastern tower saw the change and felt relief. His watch was nearly over. Soon he would be replaced and he could rest. He stood at the parapet and watched the horizon, waiting for the sun. In the kitchen, Alice arrived to start the fires. She found Marjorie asleep and woke her gently, as she had the morning before. Marjorie stirred, opened her eyes, and smiled. Another night had passed. Another day was beginning. She stood and stretched, gathering her things, preparing to return to the attic for a few hours of sleep before her work began again. The cycle repeated. It always did. Dawn followed. Night followed dawn in an endless succession. The castle woke. The servants returned to their tasks. The lord rose to face another day of responsibilities. The lady returned to her embroidery. Piers checked on his horses. The monk finished his vigil and sought his bed. Everything continued as it had before, as it would continue tomorrow and the day after and all the days that followed. But within this repetition there were variations, small differences that marked the passage of time. Alice's sister was recovering. The lame horse was healing. The guard was learning to manage his exhaustion. Marjorie was finding peace in her solitary nights. These were the threads that made up the tapestry of life in the castle, each one small and seemingly insignificant, but together creating a picture of great complexity and beauty. The sun rose, painting the stones golden. The courtyard filled with people, each going about their business. The day began, and with it came all the challenges and satisfactions that made up ordinary life. There were meals to prepare and accounts to balance and letters to write and horses to groom and prayers to say. There was work to be done, always work, but also moments of rest and connection and quiet joy. In the great hall, the travellers were packing up their belongings, preparing to leave. They thanked the Lord for his hospitality, and he nodded graciously, wishing them safe travels. They loaded their cart and passed through the gate, disappearing down the road. The guard watched them go, then returned to his duties. The castle settled back into its routine, the brief disruption of the travellers' visit already fading from memory. In the lady's solar, planning for the harvest feast continued. The lady sat with her lists and calculations, determining what could be afforded and what could not. Her daughter helped, offering suggestions, learning the skills she would need in her own household someday. It was tedious work, but necessary, and both women approached it with patience and care. The kitchen hummed with activity. Marjorie and her assistants were preparing bread for the next several days, kneading dough, shaping loaves, setting them to rise. The oven had been heated, and soon the smell of baking bread would fill the castle. It was a comforting smell, one that spoke of home and sustenance and care. Marjorie worked steadily, her hands moving with practiced skill, her mind at peace. In the stables, the farrier had arrived to examine the lame horse. He was an older man, experienced and knowledgeable, and he took his time with the examination. He ran his hands over the horse's leg, lifted the hoof, checked the joints. Finally, he straightened up and announced that the horse would be fine. It needed rest, but with proper care it would make a full recovery. Piers felt vindicated. His instincts had been correct. The horse would heal. The farrier moved on to the other horses, checking their hooves, filing down rough edges, replacing worn shoes. Piers watched and learned, asking occasional questions. The farrier answered patiently, explaining his techniques, sharing his knowledge. It was an informal apprenticeship, the kind that happened constantly in the castle, as older workers passed their skills to younger ones. The morning progressed. The sun climbed higher. The heat began to build again, though not quite as intensely as the day before. There was a hint of change in the air, a suggestion that autumn was approaching. The endless summer heat would soon break, giving way to cooler temperatures and shorter days. People welcomed the thought. Summer had been long and hard, and they were ready for change. In the Lord's study, the morning meeting with the steward had concluded. The Lord sat alone now, staring at the letter from his neighbour, trying to decide how to respond. He picked up his quill and began to write, then stopped, crossed out what he had written, and started again. The words would not come. He was unsure what to say, how to phrase his acceptance of the meeting invitation without seeming too eager or too reluctant. Finally, he simply wrote that he would attend and looked forward to the discussion. It was bland and non-committal, but it would suffice. He sealed the letter and set it aside for the messenger. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out over his lands. The fields stretched away in neat rows, the crops growing well. It would be a good harvest, as Marjorie had predicted. That was something to be grateful for. Food meant survival. meant the ability to pay taxes and maintain the castle and keep everyone fed. Without a good harvest, everything else fell apart. He thought about the men he would have to send to war, about the letter that sat in his desk awaiting implementation. He had not yet announced his decision, had not yet called the men together to inform them. He was putting it off, avoiding the moment when he would have to look them in the eyes and tell them they were being sent to fight and possibly die. It was cowardice, he knew, but he could not help it. He hated this part of his role, hated the responsibility of sending men to their deaths. His wife appeared in the doorway, and he turned to face her. She said nothing, simply stood there, waiting. He crossed to her and took her hand, holding it for a moment. It was a rare gesture of affection, and she seemed surprised. Then she squeezed his hand gently and left, returning to her solar. He watched her go, feeling a surge of something he could not quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply recognition that they were in this together, partners in a difficult life. The day continued. Tasks were completed. Meals were prepared and eaten. The castle functioned as it always did, a complex organism made up of many parts, each essential to the whole. And as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, people prepared once again for the transition from day to night, from activity to rest, from light to darkness. The evening meal was served. The household gathered in the great hall, food was eaten, ale was drunk, conversations were had. It was the same as every evening, yet slightly different. There were new topics of conversation, new concerns, new moments of connection. Life was like that. A series of repetitions that were never quite identical, a pattern that varied in small ways while remaining fundamentally the same. When the meal ended, people dispersed. The lord retired to his chamber with his wife. The servants cleaned up and went to their quarters. The guard prepared for his watch. The monk prepared for his vigil. Marjorie returned to her place by the oven. Piers checked on his horses one last time. The cycle repeated, as it always would, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries to come. The night came. The darkness settled over the castle like a blanket. The moon rose, the stars emerged, and the castle breathed. Inside its walls, people slept or woke or kept watch, each playing their small part in the great ongoing drama of life. They did not think about the larger meaning of their existence, about their place in history or the grand sweep of time. They thought about the immediate, the tangible, the next moment and the next task. That was all they could manage. That was all anyone could manage. And the castle held them, protected them, gave them shelter and purpose. It was their home, their world, the centre of their existence. Beyond its walls the world stretched, away in darkness, unknown and unknowable. But inside there was light and warmth and community. There was work to be done and food to eat and people to talk to. There was life, with all its challenges and satisfactions, its sorrows and joys. The guard walked his circuit on the wall, his footsteps steady and sure. The monk knelt in the chapel, his prayers a constant murmur in the darkness. Marjorie sat by the oven, her eyes closed, her mind drifting. Piers lay in the stable loft, listening to the horses below. Each was alone, yet each was connected to all the others, bound together by their shared existence within these ancient walls. The night wore on, the hours passed, the castle breathed, and in the darkness, in the silence, there was a kind of peace, a sense that all was as it should be, that the world was in order, that life would continue. It was a fragile peace, easily broken, but for now it held. And that was enough. The moon crossed the sky. The stars wheeled overhead. The darkness slowly began to thin, becoming grey rather than black. Dawn approached as it always did, bringing with it the promise of a new day. The cycle would repeat. The castle would wake. Life would continue. And the people within its walls would carry on, doing what needed to be done, living their lives as best they could, finding meaning in the small moments, the brief connections, the quiet satisfactions of work completed and duty fulfilled. This was life in the castle. This was how it had always been. This was how it would always be. The stones would endure, the walls would stand, and the people would come and go, generation after generation, each leaving their mark however small, each contributing to the great ongoing story that was larger than any individual life. The castle remembered them all, held them all in its silent embrace, and in doing so, gave their lives meaning and purpose and connection to something eternal. The dawn that came next brought with it a change in the weather. The air was cooler, crisper, carrying with it the scent of approaching autumn. The servants who emerged into the courtyard noticed it immediately, pausing to breathe deeply, grateful for the relief after weeks of oppressive heat. The guard on the eastern tower felt it too, and it lifted his spirits. He had been dreading another hot day, another watch spent sweating under the sun. But this change promised something different, something easier. In the kitchen, Alice was the first to arrive, as always. She built up the fire, but today she did not need to make it as large. The morning chill was pleasant rather than uncomfortable, and the kitchen warmed quickly to a comfortable temperature. She set about preparing the morning meal with renewed energy, humming softly to herself as she worked. Her sister was improving, had been able to sit up yesterday and take some broth. The fever had broken. Alice felt lighter than she had in days, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. When Marjorie arrived, she immediately noticed Alice's improved mood. She said nothing, but she smiled, understanding without needing to ask. Good news was rare enough that it deserved to be savoured silently without commentary. She set about her own tasks, working alongside Alice in companionable quiet, and the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of morning. In the chapel, the monk who had kept vigil through the night was finishing his final prayers. He had felt the change in temperature, had noticed how the dawn light seemed different, clearer somehow. He took it as a sign, though of what he was not certain. Perhaps simply that the world was turning as it always did from one season to another. He rose stiffly from his knees and made his way to the sacristy, where he washed his face and hands in cold water. The shock of it helped wake him fully, clearing away the fog of exhaustion that always came after a night of prayer. He thought about the travellers who had stayed in the castle 2 nights before. He had seen them briefly in the courtyard before they left, and had been struck by something in their faces, a kind of weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. They were people who had seen much of the world, who had experienced things he could only imagine. He wondered what it would be like to travel as they did, to move from place to place with no permanent home. It seemed both frightening and appealing. Frightening because of the uncertainty, the lack of stability. Appealing because of the freedom, the possibility of seeing new things, meeting new people. But he had chosen a different path. He had committed himself to this place, to this life of prayer and service. He would never travel as those merchants did. He would live out his days within these walls, growing old in service to God. It was a choice he had made freely, and most days he did not regret it. But sometimes, in moments like this, he wondered what other lives he might have lived. He shook off these thoughts and made his way to the small house he shared with his brother monks. Inside, he found bread and cheese waiting for him, along with a cup of weak ale. He ate slowly, his mind still partly in the prayer state, not quite ready to engage with the ordinary world. When he finished, he lay down on his narrow bed and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, pulling him down into darkness. In the Lord's chamber, both the Lord and his wife were awake. They had risen earlier than usual, drawn by the change in the weather. The Lord stood at the window looking out over his lands, breathing the cool morning air. His wife sat on the edge of the bed, braiding her hair. They did not speak, but there was a companionability in their silence, a sense of shared experience. The Lord was thinking about the meeting with his neighbour, which was scheduled for tomorrow. He had received a reply to his letter confirming the time and place. The neighbour had also mentioned that several other local lords would be in attendance. This suggested something more significant than a simple social call. The Lord felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What could require a meeting of multiple lords? Was there some threat he had not heard about? Some opportunity that needed to be discussed? His wife finished with her hair and stood, crossing to where he stood. She looked out the window beside him, following his gaze across the landscape. She knew he was worried about something, could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the slight frown that creased his brow. She wanted to ask what troubled him, but she knew he would not tell her. He never did. His concerns were his own, kept private, shared with no one. She had learned long ago not to press him. Instead, she simply stood beside him, offering her presence as comfort. After a moment, he seemed to relax slightly, and she took that as acknowledgement. Then she turned away and began to dress for the day, and he did the same, and the moment of connection passed as quickly as it had come. In the stables, Piers was already at work. He had checked on the lame horse first thing, as he did every morning, and was pleased to see continued improvement. The horse was walking normally now, showing no sign of discomfort. In another few days it would be ready to return to work. Piers felt proud of his role in the recovery, though he knew better than to take too much credit. The horse had healed itself, really. All he had done was provide care and attention. The other stable boys were arriving now, yawning and stretching, still half asleep. They set about their tasks without needing to be told, each knowing what was expected. The stables had their own rhythm, their own routine, and everyone fell into it naturally. Horses were fed and watered, stalls were cleaned, tack was checked and repaired where necessary. It was repetitive work, but there was satisfaction in it, in seeing tasks completed, in knowing that the animals were well cared for. One of the horses, a young mare, was scheduled to be trained that day. She had been in the stables for several weeks, getting accustomed to human presence, and now it was time to begin the actual training. The head groom would handle it personally, and Piers had been invited to watch and assist. It was an honour, a sign that his work was valued, that he was being prepared for greater responsibility. He felt nervous but excited, eager to learn. The training began after the morning meal. The head groom brought the mare into the courtyard where there was more space to work. A small crowd gathered to watch, servants and guards taking a break from their duties to see how the young horse would respond. The mare was skittish at first, dancing sideways, tossing her head, but the head groom was patient, speaking to her in a low, calm voice, letting her settle. Gradually the mare relaxed, and the training began in earnest. Piers watched intently, memorising every movement, every technique. The way the groom held the lead rope, giving the horse space but maintaining control. The way he rewarded good behaviour with gentle pats and soothing words. The way he corrected bad behaviour firmly, but without anger. It was a masterclass in horsemanship, and Piers absorbed every detail. When the session ended, the groom handed him the rope and told him to walk the mare around the courtyard to cool her down. Piers took the rope carefully, feeling the weight of responsibility, and led the mare in slow circles. The horse followed calmly, and Piers felt a surge of satisfaction. In the ladies' solar, preparations for the harvest feast were nearing completion. The lady sat with her steward, reviewing the final arrangements. The menu had been decided, the seating chart finalised, the entertainment confirmed. Everything was in order. The feast would take place in 3 days, and the lady felt confident that it would be a success. Her daughter sat nearby, embroidering, half listening to the conversation. She had been present for all the planning sessions and had absorbed much about the process. When her time came to manage such events, she would be prepared. The lady dismissed the steward and sat back in her chair, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. This was her domain, this planning and organising, and she was good at it. It gave her a sense of purpose, of control over at least one aspect of her life. So much was beyond her control, determined by her husband or by circumstances, or by the larger forces of society. But this she could manage. This was hers. Her daughter looked up from her embroidery and asked a question about the feast, about why certain guests had been seated in particular positions. The lady explained the reasoning, the careful balancing of status and relationships, the need to avoid potential conflicts while encouraging useful connections. The girl nodded, understanding, and returned to her work. The lady watched her for a moment, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. Her daughter was growing up, becoming capable and intelligent. Soon she would leave, and the lady would be alone. She pushed the thought away and stood, crossing to the window. The courtyard below was busy with activity. She could see Piers walking the young mare, could see servants carrying baskets and bundles, could see the guard changing shifts on the wall. Life continued as it always did, everyone playing their part in the great ongoing drama. She was part of it too, playing her role as lady of the castle, managing the household, maintaining appearances. It was what she had been born to do, what she had been trained for, and she would continue to do it, day after day, year after year, until she could do it no longer. In the kitchen, Marjorie was preparing the midday meal. It was a simpler affair than the evening meal, usually just bread and cheese and cold meat, but it still required preparation. She sliced bread, arranged cheese on platters, set out cups and pitchers of ale. Her assistants helped, working efficiently, and soon everything was ready. The household would eat in shifts, servants coming to the kitchen to collect their portions and taking them to eat wherever they worked. It was less formal than the evening meal, more practical, designed to keep people fed and working rather than to bring them together. Alice was kneading dough for tomorrow's bread, her hands working the mass rhythmically. She'd been teaching one of the younger girls how to do it properly, and now the girl was trying it herself, struggling with the technique. Alice watched patiently, offering occasional guidance, letting the girl learn through practice. It was how she herself had learned, years ago, when she'd been new to the kitchen. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next, skills transmitted through demonstration and repetition. Marjorie watched them work and felt a sense of continuity, of belonging to something larger than herself. She was part of a long chain of women who had worked in this kitchen, who had prepared meals and taught apprentices and kept the household fed. She would not be remembered individually. Her name would be forgotten, but her work would continue, carried on by those who came after her. That was a kind of immortality, she supposed, not the grand immortality of kings and nobles, whose names were recorded in books, but a humbler kind, the immortality of tradition and craft. The midday meal was served, and the kitchen emptied as servants took their food and went back to work. Marjorie sat down with her own portion, eating slowly, savouring the brief moment of quiet. Alice joined her, and they ate together in companionable silence. When they finished, they cleared away the remnants and began preparing for the evening meal. There was always more to do, always the next task waiting. In the Lord's study, the steward was presenting a problem. One of the tenant farmers had fallen behind on his rent and was requesting more time to pay. The Lord listened, his face expressionless. This was not unusual. There were always tenants who struggled, who needed extensions or reductions. But the Lord also needed the income. He could not afford to be too lenient, or everyone would start asking for special treatment. He asked the steward for details. How far behind was the farmer? What were his circumstances? Did he have a history of late payments? The steward provided the information, and the Lord considered it carefully. The farmer had been reliable in the past. He had fallen behind because of illness, had been unable to work for several weeks. His family had done what they could, but it had not been enough. The Lord decided to grant an extension, but only a short one. The farmer would have until after the harvest to make his payment. If he failed to do so, there would be consequences. The steward made a note and moved on to the next item. There were always more items, more decisions to be made. The Lord worked through them methodically, listening to each problem, weighing the options, making his choice. It was exhausting work, mentally draining, requiring constant attention and judgment. But it was his responsibility, and he would not shirk it. When the steward finally left, the Lord sat alone in his study, rubbing his temples. He felt a headache coming on, a dull pressure behind his eyes. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at his lands, trying to clear his mind. Tomorrow he would attend the meeting with his neighbours. He would learn what they wanted to discuss. For now he could only wait and prepare himself mentally for whatever was to come. The afternoon passed. The sun moved across the sky, its light shifting from bright and harsh to warm and golden. The temperature remained pleasant, the cool morning having given way to mild afternoon warmth. People worked steadily, taking advantage of the comfortable conditions. There was a sense of satisfaction in the air, a feeling that the oppressive heat had finally broken, that the worst of summer was behind them. In the courtyard the children were playing again. They had invented a new game involving a ball made of rags and 2 goals marked with stones. They ran and shouted, kicking the ball back and forth, their faces flushed with exertion and joy. The woman who watched over them sat on her bench, mending as always, smiling at their enthusiasm. Children were remarkable, she thought. No matter how hard life became, they found ways to play, to laugh, to be happy. Adults could learn from that. One of the boys kicked the ball too hard and it sailed over the wall into the area beyond. The children groaned, and 2 of them ran to retrieve it. The woman called after them to be careful, to watch for horses and carts. They waved, acknowledgement, and disappeared through the gate. A few minutes later they returned with the ball and the game resumed. In the chapel, the afternoon prayers were being said. Several monks had gathered, along with a few servants who had time to attend. Their voices rose in unison, chanting the familiar Latin phrases. The sound echoed off the stone walls, creating a resonance that was both beautiful and solemn. Those who prayed felt lifted by it, carried beyond themselves into something larger and more significant. The monk who had kept vigil the night before was not present. He was still sleeping, his body recovering from the long hours of wakefulness. He would wake in the early evening, eat a simple meal, and prepare for another night of prayer. It was a demanding schedule, but he had grown accustomed to it. His body had adapted, learning to function on irregular sleep, learning to find rest in brief intervals. In the stables, the training session had concluded and Piers was grooming the young mare. The horse had done well, had shown intelligence and willingness to learn. The head groom had praised her, saying she would make a fine riding horse once her training was complete. Piers felt a connection to the mare, having been present for this important step in her development. He brushed her coat carefully, talking to her in a low voice, telling her what a good horse she was. The other horses watched from their stalls, calm and patient. They knew the rhythms of the stable, knew when they would be fed and exercised and groomed. There was security in that knowledge, in the predictability of their lives. Humans sought the same thing, Piers thought. Security. Predictability. A sense that tomorrow would be much like today. It was why people stayed in the same place, did the same work, followed the same routines. Change was frightening. Sameness was comforting. He finished with the mare and moved on to the next horse. The work was endless, but he did not mind. It gave him purpose, gave structure to his days. Without it, he would not know what to do with himself. He would be adrift, purposeless. So he was grateful for the work, even when it was hard, even when he was tired. It was what kept him grounded, what gave his life meaning. The evening approached. The sun sank lower, its light turning the stones of the castle warm and amber. Shadows lengthened across the courtyard. The air grew cooler, and people began to think about the evening meal, about rest and warmth. The day's work was not yet done, but it was winding down, approaching its conclusion. In the kitchen, preparations for the evening meal were well underway. Marjorie and her assistants worked steadily, their movements practiced and efficient. The smell of roasting meat filled the air along with the scent of baking bread and herbs. It was a comforting combination, one that spoke of home and sustenance. People passing through the courtyard paused to inhale deeply, their mouths watering, in anticipation. Alice was stirring a large pot of pottage, a thick vegetable stew that would be served alongside the meat. She added salt, tasted, added more. Getting the seasoning right was important. Too little, and the food was bland. Too much, and it was inedible. She had learned through years of practice to judge the exact amount needed, and she took pride in her skill. One of the younger girls asked her a question about the pottage, about when to add certain vegetables. Alice explained patiently, describing how different vegetables required different cooking times, how some needed to be added early to soften, while others should be added late to retain their texture. The girl listened carefully, nodding, and Alice could see her committing the information to memory. This was how knowledge was passed on, through these informal lessons, these moments of teaching and learning. In the great hall, servants were setting up for the evening meal. The routine was so familiar now that it required almost no thought. Tables were arranged, benches pulled out, platters and cups set in place. The fire was built up, crackling cheerfully, driving away the evening chill. Soon the household would gather, and the hall would fill with voices and laughter and the sounds of eating. For now it was empty and waiting, a space of potential. The lord emerged from his chamber, dressed for the evening meal. His wife walked beside him, and they made their way to the great hall in silence. When they entered, the servants bowed, and they took their places at the high table. The rest of the household began to file in, taking their assigned seats. There was a brief moment of settling, of people finding their places and arranging themselves, and then the meal began. Food was served, and people ate with appreciation. The meat was well cooked, the bread fresh, the pottage flavourful. Ale flowed freely, and conversations began, voices rising to fill the hall. The lord ate mechanically, his mind already on tomorrow's meeting. He nodded occasionally when someone addressed him, but he was not really present. His thoughts were elsewhere, running through possible scenarios, trying to prepare for every eventuality. His wife noticed his distraction, but said nothing. She ate quietly, listening to the conversations around her, occasionally responding when addressed. She was good at this, at being present without drawing attention to herself, at fulfilling her role without making demands. It was what was expected of her, and she did it well. The meal concluded, and people began to disperse. Some returned to their duties, others sought their beds. The hall emptied slowly, and servants began the clean-up. Plates were collected, tables wiped down, the floor swept. Within an hour the hall was empty and clean, ready for the next day. The lord retired to his chamber with his wife. They prepared for bed in their usual silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. When they finally lay down, the lord fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's concerns. His wife lay awake, as always, staring into the darkness. She thought about her daughter, about the feast that would take place in 2 days, about the changes that autumn would bring. Her mind wandered through these topics without settling on anyone, and eventually in the early hours of the morning she finally slept. In the chapel, the monk who had slept through the afternoon was beginning his vigil. He lit the candles on the altar, arranged his prayer book, and knelt on the cold stone floor. Another night of prayer, another night of keeping watch. He began to speak the familiar Latin words, his voice low and steady, and the chapel filled with the sound of devotion. Outside, the night had fully descended. The moon was rising nearly full, casting bright light over the landscape. The guard on the eastern tower began his patrol, walking the familiar circuit, his eyes scanning the darkness. Everything was quiet. The castle was settling into its nighttime rhythm, and he was part of that rhythm, a constant presence on the walls. In the kitchen, Marjorie took her usual place by the oven. She sat with her cup of small beer, her mind drifting peacefully. She thought about the harvest feast, about the extra work it would require, about whether everything would go smoothly. She felt confident it would. They had prepared well, had thought through every detail. It would be a success. She thought about Alice's sister, about how the girl was recovering. Good news was always welcome, always worth savouring. She thought about Piers and the lame horse, about how the animal was healing. Small victories, both of them, but victories nonetheless. Life was made up of such moments, she believed. Not grand triumphs, but small successes, small reasons to be grateful. In the stables, Piers lay on his pallet, listening to the sounds of the horses below. The young mare was settling in well, adjusting to her new routine. The lame horse was nearly fully recovered. Everything was proceeding as it should. He felt satisfied, content with his work, content with his place in the world. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him, and his last thought before drifting off was that tomorrow would be a good day. The castle breathed. The night continued. The moon crossed the sky, and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Inside the walls, people slept or woke or kept watch, each playing their part, each contributing to the whole. The stones held them all, protected them all, gave them shelter and purpose, and in the darkness, in the silence, there was peace. The guard walked his circuit. The monk said his prayers. Marjorie sat by the oven. The castle endured, and life went on, as it always had, as it always would. One moment following another in an endless chain that connected past and present and future, binding all who lived within these walls into a single continuous story. Dawn would come again, the sun would rise, the cycle would repeat, and the castle would stand as it had stood for centuries, as it would stand for centuries more, a testament to endurance and continuity, to the human need for shelter and community and belonging. The people within it would continue their lives, doing their work, finding their moments of connection and joy, enduring their hardships with patience and grace. This was life in the castle. This was the rhythm of existence. This was how it had always been. This was how it would always be. The stones remembered, the walls stood, and the story continued day after day, night after night, forever.